Ankylosauria includes the great majority of dinosaurs with armor in the form of bony osteoderms, similar to turtles. They were bulky quadrupeds, with short, powerful limbs. They are known to have first appeared in the Middle Jurassic, and persisted until the end of the Cretaceous period. Minmi is considered a primitive ankylosaur because it retained features that were lost in later, more advanced members of its group. For example, its armor was less specialized, and it had relatively long legs, suggesting it might have been more agile than its later relatives. Unlike some other ankylosaurs that had heavy, clubbed tails, Minmi's tail was relatively simple, indicating that it didn't use its tail as a primary weapon. Instead, its defense relied more on its body armor. The preserved dermal spikes of the Spicamelus were fused directly to the bone, a trait unique to this animal and not known from any other vertebrate. In all other known ankylosaurs, the osteoderms are embedded into the muscle tissue, rather than fused to underlying bone. The discovery of Spicamelus also shows that the two major thyreophorine groups coexisted for over 20 million years, and implies that the putative extinction of the stegosaurs in the early Cretaceous may have happened for reasons other than an increased diversity of ankylosaurs at that time. Material for Gyrgaeangosaurus consists of the holotype, a partial skeleton which has preserved a sacrum with 8 vertebrae, a complete right ilium and partial left ilium, a complete right pubis, the proximal end of the right ischium, 2 complete hind limbs, 14 caudal vertebrae, and some unidentified bones. These remains come from Liancheng, in the Chinese administrative unit of Lishui on the province of Zhejiang, and they were collected from the Cenomanian Age Chaochuan Formation. Gyrgaeangosaurus could grow up to 4.5 meters in length and was 1.5 tons in weight. Antarctopelta, based on phylogenetic bracketing and known material, probably had a maculoweedle like its relative Steguros. This structure was made up of several fused, flat osteoderms that occupied the end of the tail. Inside much of the maculoweedle there are no vertebrae, creating a largely fleshy space. The osteoderms are spiked and point outwards in a frond-like pattern, suggesting a defensive function. Like other ankylosaurs, it was a stocky, herbivorous quadruped protected by armor plates embedded in the skin. Although a complete skeleton has not been found, the species is estimated to have reached a maximum length of 4 meters from snout to tail tip. The holotype skeleton was collected about 90 meters from the base of the Gamma member of the Snow Hill Island Formation. It is one of only 2 major dinosaur-bearing rock formations found on Antarctica, bearing all but 2 of the continents named dinosaurs. The floral composition, habitat and climate are similar to modern volcanic arches. During the time in which Antarctopelta lived, Earth's climate was much warmer and more humid than it is today, and as a result Antarctica was without ice. The animals inhabiting Antarctica at this time would still have had to endure long periods of darkness during the winter, much like in modern-day Antarctica. Known from the late Cretaceous of southern Chile, Steguros was around 1.5 meters long, roughly the size of a large dog. It had a proportionally larger head and more slender limbs than most other ankylosaurs, and a pelvis more resembling a stegosaur, but its most distinctive feature was its tail. It had a completely unique never-before-seen type of tail weapon, with a flat, frond-like structure formed from several pairs of large fused osteoderms making a shape resembling a maculoweedle. It seems to have been part of a previously unrecognized very early branching lineage of Gondwanan ankylosaurs, with its closest relatives Antarctopelta also included in this new group. And since the tail regions of both of those other species are poorly known, this means they may also have possessed maculohoodles. Nodosaurids, like their sister group the Ankylosaurids, were heavily armored dinosaurs adorned with rows of bony armor nodules and spines, which were covered in keratin sheaths. They were small to large-sized, heavily built, quadrupedal, herbivorous dinosaurs, possessing small, leaf-shaped teeth. Unlike Ankylosaurids, Nodosaurids lacked mace-like tail clubs, instead having more flexible tail tips. Many Nodosaurids had spikes projecting outward from their shoulders. Mimorapelta was a small nodosaurid, about 3 meters long, with a narrow snout, triangular skull, and distinctive horns and armor types. It was a low browser in the Morrison ecosystem, feeding on cycads and conifers, unlike the high-browsing Apatosaurus from the same region. Gastonia lived in a dry, partly wooded habitat with riverine forests, alongside other dinosaurs like Utahraptor and Sidarosaurus. It was the only ankylosaurian in its ecosystem and one of the most common species. Gastonia's abundance may have been due to its effective armor, which protected it against predators like Utahraptor. Its defensive strategy likely included both passive protection from vertical spikes and active defense using horizontal tail spikes. The armor may have also played a role in male-male competition, with vertical spikes used for intimidation and headbutting. Gastonia's downturned head and flexible skull were possibly adaptations for such behavior. Despite being ankylosaurs, often thought to be solitary due to their short legs, the concentration of Gastonia fossils suggests they may have lived in groups. Gastonia was protected by osteoderms, skin ossifications. The neck was covered by at least 2 bone rings. Usually in ankylosaurs these have the form of half rings, leaving the underside unprotected, but with Gastonia only 2 segments seem present, one at each side of the midline, causing Kirkland to refer to them as quarter rings. Gargoyleosaurus was a relatively small ankylosaur, reaching 3 meters in length and 300 to 750 kilograms in body mass. Much of the skull and skeleton has been recovered, and the taxon displays cranial sculpturing, including pronounced deltoid quadratojugal and squamosal bosses. The taxon is further characterized by a narrow rostrum, the presence of 7 conical teeth in each premaxilla, an incomplete osseous nasal septum, a linearly arranged nasal cavity, the absence of an osseous secondary palate, and, as regards osteoderms, 2 sets of co-ossified cervical plates and a number of elongate conical spines. A very unusual feature is the sagittal osteoderm on the first set of cervical plates. In most other ankylosaurs, these osteoderms are bilateral, paired with one on each side of the midline. Invictrix was described relatively recently, in 2018, based on fossils found in the Menifee Formation of New Mexico. Its discovery added to the growing knowledge of nodosaur diversity in North America during the late Cretaceous period. The genus name means invincible fortress, highlighting its heavily armored body. The fossil remains show that it had large, bony plates covering its back and sides, providing significant protection from predators. The current understanding of Invictrix is based on limited fossil material, including osteoderms and vertebrae, which means that much of its biology and behavior remain speculative. Future discoveries may provide more detailed information about this dinosaur. Polacanthus is one of the more famous nodosaurids due to its early discovery in the history of paleontology, though at that point it was only known from the rear half of the body. It lived about 130 to 125 million years ago, in the Valanginian to Hodorivian ages of the early Cretaceous. It was found on the Isle of Wight, in the Wessex Formation, making it one of the many dinosaurs known from early Cretaceous England. It was named for the osteoderms known from the animal. Scatterings of remains have been attributed to the animal since then, as often happens with early named taxa, and many of these taxa have thus been separated out upon finding that they were actually different genera from Polacanthus. Still yet, others such as Vectentia have been lumped back in with Polacanthus. It isn't known from extensive material, but it was probably a medium-sized nodosaur, about 5 meters long. The exact configuration of the osteoderms is poorly known, with most reconstructions of the animal based upon Gastonia. Sauropelta was a heavily built quadrupedal herbivore, measuring about 5 to 6 meters in length and weighing 1.5 to 2 tons. Its skull was triangular, with a wide, flat roof covered in tightly fused bony plates, and it featured leaf-shaped teeth for cutting plant material. The tail was exceptionally long, making up nearly half its body length, and was stiffened by ossified tendons. Sauropelta's body was broad, with stout limbs and a reinforced structure to support its weight. It was covered in armor made of bony masses, including large pointed spines along its neck and sides. The cervical spines and caudal plates were arranged in 2 parallel rows on each side, restricting mobility in the neck and tail. Like its relatives, Nodosaurus had 4 short legs, 5-toed feet, a short neck, and a long, stiff, clubless tail. The head was narrow, with a pointed snout, powerful jaws, and small teeth. It perhaps ate soft plants, as it would have been unable to chew tough, fibrous ones, or alternatively it may have processed the latter with gastroliths and its enormous intestinal apparatus. The dermal plates were arranged in bands along its body, with narrow bands over the ribs alternating with wider plates in between. These wider plates were covered in regularly arranged bony nodules, which give the animal its scientific name. Edmontonia was a heavily armored dinosaur with small, oval-ridged bony plates on its back and head, along with sharp spikes along its sides. The largest spikes were on its shoulders. Its skull was pear-shaped when viewed from above, and its neck and shoulders were protected by 3 half-rings of large keeled plates. The genus was distinguished by traits such as a more parallel-sided snout, smooth skull armor, and shorter neural arches compared to its close relative, Panoplosaurus. The large spikes were probably used between males in contests of strength to defend territory or gain mates. The spikes would also have been useful for intimidating predators or rival males, passive protection, or for active self-defense. The large forward-pointing shoulder spikes could have been used to run through attacking theropods. Rings in the petrified wood of trees contemporary with Edmontonia show evidence of strong seasonal changes in precipitation and temperature. This may hold an explanation for why so many specimens have been found with their armor plating and spikes in the same position they were in life. The Edmontonia could have died due to drought, dried up, and then rapidly became covered in sediment when the rainy season began. Hungarosaurus walked on 4 legs and its body was covered with hundreds of osteoderms. The length of mature specimens was about 4 meters. Like other nodosaurids, it was an herbivore. It is known from 4 specimens, preserving parts of the skull and skeleton, as well as osteoderms. It in fact had over 100 osteoderms. It lived alongside a dromaeosaurid and an ornithopod similar to Rabidon. It had very long legs and a large cerebellum, indicating that it was more cursorial than other ankylosaurs, and probably could have moved quite fast, indicating it had a different ecological niche, or different kinds of predators were encountering it in its habitat. The studies show that Hungarosaurus is slightly more advanced than Struthiosaurus, but more primitive than the North American nodosaurid Sylvosaurus, Sauropelta and Papasaurus. This was supported by cladistic analysis, which suggests that it is a basal member of the family Nodosauridae. The excellently named Anomantarx, meaning living fortress, a nodosaurid ankylosaur from the mid-Cretaceous of Utah, about 100 million years ago. It was fairly small compared to other ankylosaurs, estimated to have been about 3 meters long. Fossils in the area are naturally slightly radioactive, and the only known specimen of Anomantarx was actually discovered entirely remotely using a scintillation counter. It was the first dinosaur to be detected via technology rather than human observation. Subsequent excavation at this site turned up the fossil skeleton of Anomantarx. No bones had been exposed on the surface. Hylaeosaurus is a significant dinosaur, being one of the first discovered and one of the 3 dinosaurs Richard Owen used to define Dinosauria. Although not as famous as Megalosaurus and Iguanodon, this is partly due to the limited knowledge of its anatomy. It lived around 136 million years ago during the Valanginian age of the early Cretaceous and was found in West Sussex, in England. Early reconstructions mistakenly depicted it as a deformed lizard, reflecting the limited understanding of its bird-like features at the time. Hylaeosaurus was about 5 meters long, with curved spines at the shoulder, and belonged to the Nodosaur family, a group of ankylosaurs without tail clubs. Papasaurus was primitive in regards to its sensory abilities when compared to later ankylosaurs. CT scans of its skull and brain by Paulina Carabajal and Louis Jacobs et al. Revealed that Papasaurus' hearing was on par with that of modern crocodilians, indicating that its hearing was relatively poor. Its sense of smell meanwhile, while not as advanced as that of later ankylosaurs, was still more powerful and acute than many of the theropods existent at the time thanks to its large nasal cavities. The enlarged nasal cavities of Papasaurus would also likely have been useful for cooling blood that was entering the brain, finding food and potential mates, or alerting it to danger. Borealopelta is one of the best preserved dinosaur fossils ever discovered. The fossil is so well preserved that it includes not only the bones but also the skin, armor and even traces of the pigments that colored its skin. Analysis of Borealopelta's fossilized skin revealed that it had a reddish-brown color with a lighter underside, a pattern known as countershading. This suggests that it used camouflage to protect itself from predators, which is surprising for a heavily armored dinosaur. It was an ankylosaur, specifically a nodosaurid, known for its extensive body armor. It had large, bony plates covering its back and sides, with long spikes on its shoulders, providing formidable defense against predators. It was an herbivore, and its fossilized stomach contents were preserved, providing rare direct evidence of its diet. The contents included ferns and other low-lying plants, confirming its diet consisted mainly of these types of vegetation. The remarkable preservation of Borealopelta is believed to be due to a rapid burial at sea. It's thought that the dinosaur's body was washed out to sea and quickly buried by sediments, which prevented decay and scavenging. The discovery in 2011 by a miner working in an oil sands mine in Alberta has provided unprecedented insights into the life and appearance of armored dinosaurs, offering a rare glimpse into the skin color, diet, and defensive strategies of these ancient creatures. Europelta was the first ankylosaur to be discovered and described from the Iberian Peninsula. Its discovery in Spain has added significant information to the understanding of ankylosaur diversity in Europe during the early Cretaceous period. It had distinctive body armor, characterized by large, flat, osteoderms that covered its body. The arrangement and shape of these plates helped paleontologists differentiate it from other ankylosaurs and suggest it had robust protection against predators. It was a medium-sized ankylosaur, estimated to be about 5 meters long. Its body was low to the ground, with stout limbs and a wide, flat body, typical of ankylosaurs, which were built for defense rather than speed. Stegopelta was a nodosaur, an armored dinosaur known for its specialized osteoderms and narrow snout used for selective foraging. The fossil record for Stegopelta is limited and includes fragments of the jaw, vertebrae, hips, limbs, and back armor, though these remains were damaged by erosion and cattle. It had distinctive armor patterns, including fused regions over its hips and split spines on its shoulders, though much of its anatomy remains unclear. Stegopelta was likely a slow-moving, low-level browser, relying on its armor for defense against predators. It probably spent much of its time foraging for specific plants, and it might have lived near beach ecosystems, as its fossils were found in an ocean formation. Little is known about its behavior, and it's uncertain if it associated with other dinosaur species like ornithopods. Struthiosaurus was named like this because its brain case, which is very bird-like, from which the original specimen is known. This bird-like brain case is notably large, which could indicate interesting behavioral differences from other ankylosaurs. Other material besides the brain case is indeed known, with multiple species assigned to the genus. Examinations of the brain of Struthiosaurus published in 2022 suggest it had very poor hearing and relied mostly on its armor for defense against predators. Its flocculus was very small and its lagina were very short, suggesting it was very sluggish in nature as well as solitary. Originally interpreted Alitopelta as an indeterminate nodosaurid that showed similarities with Edmontonia, but refrained from naming it as they considered it to be undiagnostic. The classification of this genus seems very complex for paleontologists because the remains are very partial. Others consider it to be a basal ankylosaur with a clubless tail. In this video, Alitopelta is classified within the Ankylosaurid family, but nothing is certain yet. Its classification will likely be clarified with future discoveries, if any. The find is from a marine formation, indicating that the animal is a carcass that floated out to sea, forming a miniature reef environment after sinking to the ground. Pelecypoda, a bivalve, was found on the remains, and there is indication that it was fed on by sharks. In 2016, G and colleagues proposed that Lioningosaurus might have been adapted to a semi-aquatic lifestyle, based on the discovery of a shell-like ventral bony plate thought to protect against underwater attacks. However, other studies reinterpreted this structure as skin impressions or a ventral pelvic shield with an epidermal cover, not indicating a semi-aquatic adaptation. G's team also suggested that it was piscivorous, citing elongated teeth and fish remains found within the specimen's body, possibly as gut contents. Despite this, paleontologist Andrea Kaw expressed skepticism, suggesting that the evidence might simply reflect juvenile traits in scavenging fish rather than a semi-aquatic, piscivorous lifestyle. The chaotic fish distribution within the body cavity could also result from scavenging, and the aquatic environment where the fossil was found does not necessarily imply the dinosaur was aquatic. Others argue that more specimens showing similar evidence would be needed to support the hypothesis of a piscivorous diet. Unlike later forms of ankylosaurs, which are famous for their massive tail clubs used for defense, basal ankylosaurs lacked this feature. Instead, their tails were more flexible and often had spikes or simple, elongated structures. Despite lacking tail clubs, these dinosaurs were still well armored. Gobisaurus had extensive body armor in the form of osteoderms, bony plates embedded in the skin, which provided significant protection against predators. The absence of a tail club in basal ankylosaurs indicates that this feature evolved later in the ankylosaur lineage. It suggests that early ankylosaurs relied more on their body armor and potentially on other defensive behaviors. Chamosaurus scutatus shares many cranial similarities with Gobisaurus, including a rounded squamosal, large elliptical orbital fenestrae in oval external nares, a deltoid dorsal profile with a narrow rostrum. The snout is tongue-shaped and narrow in top view, quadratojugal protuberances, and caudalaterally directed paraccipital processes, extensions of the rear skull obliquely pointing to behind and sideways. But the two taxa may be distinguished by differences in the length of the maxillary tooth row, 40% instead of 27% of total skull length, an unfused basipterygoid-pterygoid process in Gobisaurus, the presence of an elongate vomerine premaxillary process in Gobisaurus, and the presence of cranial sculpting in Chamosaurus, but not in Gobisaurus. The last difference was denied by Arbour, who concluded that the degree of sculpting was roughly the same. Zongiwansaurus, like other ankylosaurids, had a variety of osteoderms embedded in its skin, with 8 distinct types identified in the holotype specimen. These included irregularly shaped quadrangles, circular and asymmetrical circular osteoderms with keels, and ridge-shaped osteoderms with grooved surfaces. An unusual arrow-shaped bone found near the nasal region was interpreted as a nasal horn used in combat, a feature unique among ankylosaurs. The tail club of Zonguiwansaurus preserved only the handle without the knob osteoderms. Despite the specimen being immature, the absence of the knob osteoderms is not attributed to its age, as later studies suggested they may have disarticulated after death. However, this explanation was eventually ruled out, as disarticulated knobs typically preserve some vertebral fragments. Dioplosaurus was an ankylosaurid dinosaur, estimated to be around 4 meters long and weighing about 1.2 tons. It is distinguishable by its unique sacral ribs, triangular unguals, and a tail club knob that is longer than it is wide. Compared to Scalosaurus and Euoplocephalus, it has notable differences in pelvic structure and tail osteoderms. The tail club of Dioplosaurus, which had ossified tendons, was smaller than that of other ankylosaurids, producing an impact force insufficient to puncture bone, suggesting it may not have been used primarily for defense. The holotype specimen also preserves fossilized skin impressions with a mosaic of small osteoderms, though these impressions are incomplete due to erosion. Ankylosaurus is the most iconic and the largest member of the ankylosaurid family. It was covered in thick, bony plates called osteoderms that provided extensive protection against predators. These osteoderms were embedded in its skin, forming a nearly impenetrable shield across its back. Its most distinctive feature was its massive tail club, which was likely used as a defensive weapon. Studies suggest that the tail club could deliver powerful blows, potentially strong enough to break the bones of attacking predators like Tyrannosaurus. Its wide, low body was ideal for grazing on low-lying plants, likely feeding on ferns and other soft vegetation. Recent studies have shown that Ankylosaurus had a complex system of nasal passages. These convoluted nasal structures might have helped to cool the animal's brain or enhance its sense of smell. The heavy armor and short limbs likely made it a slow-moving dinosaur. However, this slow pace was balanced by its defensive adaptations, making it well-equipped to withstand attacks from predators. The vertebrae of Ankylosaurus were fused, adding strength and stability to its body. This fusion of bones, along with its robust limb structure, helped support the weight of its heavy armor. The eyes of Ankylosaurus were positioned on the sides of its head, allowing it to have a wide field of vision. This adaptation likely helped it to spot approaching predators from multiple angles, giving it a defensive advantage. It was one of the last surviving ankylosaurs before the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period. Some scientists have proposed that the complex nasal passages in Ankylosaurus might have been used for vocalization. The intricate nasal structures could have allowed Ankylosaurus to produce low-frequency sounds, possibly for communication or mating calls. Euoplocephalus may have had running abilities comparable to modern rhinoceroses. Its upper arms sloped away from the body, and the species was likely solitary or lived in small groups. Its armor could have had a keratinous covering and might have played a role in thermoregulation. The tail club, supported by ossified tendons, was likely a defensive weapon capable of breaking bones, although it may have been used for both defense and intraspecific combat. Euoplocephalus had complex nasal passages, possibly for heat and water regulation, and a well-developed sense of smell. It was an herbivore with a broad muzzle, indicating it was a non-selective feeder, and its jaws were capable of complex movements for processing tough vegetation. The tail club was used as a low-swinging weapon against predators' legs. It is difficult to establish the geographical origin of Ankylosauridae at present. There is a mix of basal ankylosaurids from both North America and Asia, which carries on through accepted cladistic analyses. It appears that in the mid-Cretaceous, Asian nodosaurids were replaced by Ankylosaurians. Some researchers postulate that Ankylosaurians migrated into North America from Asia between the Albian and Campanian, where they diversified into a clade of Ankylosaurians characterized by arched snouts and flat cranial bone plates. There is no evidence for ankylosaurids in Gondwana, the southern continent. Zyapelta is known from a complete skull and the first cervical half-ring, suggesting its head and neck armor may have been separated from the body before burial. It had three unique traits: a large, triangular caputegulum on the snout, deep, anteriorly curved squamosal horns, and three deep grooves at the rear base of the skull. Additionally, the skull top featured a mix of concave, flat, and convex caputegulae. Zyapelta differs from another ankylosaur from the Kirtland formation, Nodocephalosaurus, by having sharper, more front-curved squamosal horns and more irregularly shaped caputegulae. These features help distinguish Zyapelta from other ankylosaurs. Zul is a recently described genus of Ankylosaurid from the Judith River Formation in Montana. This dinosaur is exceptionally well preserved, with portions of soft tissue, a nearly complete skull, and much of the skeleton intact, though it is still under study due to its large block entombment. The skull, which experienced some compression, features broad nostrils, extensive surrounding osteoderms, and triangular osteoderms behind the eyes, and resembles the skull of Euoplocephalus, albeit slightly flatter. Zul had massive cheek horns and the longest known tail club of any North American ankylosaurid, with preserved osteoderms and horny sheaths, and stiffening structures including 8 tendons on each side of the tail handle. The tail club is somewhat squared off and flat, with spongy and pitted osteoderms at the end. Zul is closely related to other ankylosaurids like Scalosaurus and Ankylosaurus, suggesting it shared similar traits with these relatives. Its discovery highlights the rapid evolutionary changes among ankylosaurids in North America during the late Cretaceous, paralleling other dinosaur groups of the time. Minotaurosaurus was a medium-sized ankylosaurid, with an estimated length of 4 meters, although it may have reached larger sizes as the type specimen represents an immature individual. Although not a lot of postcranial material is known, it would have had a tail club that may have been used for protection against predators or interspecific combat and would have been covered in protective osteoderms. It would have also had a barrel-like body and short, robust limbs based on close relatives. Instead of oral processing, ankylosaurids living in dry environments may have relied more on hindgut fermentation for digestion or, alternatively, consumed succulent plants that did not require complex chewing. These ankylosaurids may have also been restricted to simple orthull pulping and might have had to deal with more grit during feeding compared to ankylosaurs that lived in tropical to subtropical climates, as indicated by the microwear pits. A juvenile specimen of Pinacosaurus preserves large paraglossalia, triangular bones or cartilages located in the tongue, which show signs of muscular stress, and it is thought this was a common feature of ankylosaurs. Pinacosaurus and other ankylosaurs likely relied heavily on muscular tongues when feeding, since their teeth were fairly small and were replaced at a relatively slow rate. Some modern salamanders have similar tongue bones, and use prehensile tongues to pick up food. Though it may not have fed on fibrous and woody plants, they may have had a more varied diet, including tough leaves and pulpy fruits. Inversely, this might suggest anteater-like insectivorous behavior. The habitat of Pinacosaurus consisted of a semi-desert interspersed with oases. No large theropods are known to have inhabited the ecosystem, though smaller ones like Velociraptor were present. It has been suggested that the relatively light build of Pinacosaurus was an adaptation to gain agility to better fight small theropods, the moderately large club being fast enough to hit these swift targets. Anodontosaurus is an ankylosaurid with an impressive tail club, one of the most interesting ones among the ankylosaurids. It was found in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation in Alberta. The club was wide and pointed, and it also had different skull ornamentation from other ankylosaurs, most notably small polygonal plates of bone immediately behind the eye. It was thought for a long time to be the same dinosaur as Euoplocephalus, however, has since been separated out due to the differences in its skull and tail. A juvenile of this animal is also known from portions of the skeleton. It was a medium-sized ankylosaur, and was in the Ankylosaurini group, or those ankylosaurs most closely related to Ankylosaurus and Euoplocephalus. Talaruris is a uniquely proportioned ankylosaur from the Bayan Shiri Formation in Mongolia, dating to around the Csotonyian age of the late Cretaceous. It is known from several specimens, including much of the skull and skeleton, although the original specimen is poorly preserved. Talaruris features distinctive head ornaments, such as small tubercular osteoderms on the skull and symmetrical armor tiles, along with a V-shaped raised area on the front of the snout. The dinosaur was approximately 5 meters long and had a stiffened tail with a club at the end. Its long, narrow skull and upright stance set it apart from other ankylosaurs, and it is one of the oldest ankylosaurids known from Asia. Talaruris lived in a lowland floodplain, contrasting with desert-dwelling ankylosaurs like Cicania, which might explain its distinct snout features. The first fossils of Cicania were found in the early 1970s in Mongolia. The description of this species has been based on limited fossil material, especially the rear of the animal is not well known. It was more robustly built than other members of the Ankylosauridae, measuring 5 to 7 meters in length and 2 tons in body mass. Neck vertebrae, shoulder girdle, ribs and breast bones were fused or firmly connected. Its body was flat and low-slung, standing on 4 short legs. The forelimbs were very powerful. The head was protected by bulbous armor tiles. It could defend itself against predators like Tarbosaurus with a tail club. On the torso keeled osteoderms were present. Cicania bit off plants in its desert habitat with a horny beak and processed them in its wide hindgut. Victoria Arbour pointed out that Cicania, Tarchia and Xeraopelta shared the same habitat. She assumed that this relative ankylosaurian abundance in species had been caused by them being the main herbivores in the area, enough crop thus being available to feed 3 populations, although their relative niches were unclear. The differences in head ornamentation would then have served species recognition. She saw no indications of sexual dimorphism. Tarchia was a medium-sized ankylosaur measuring around 6 meters long and weighing up to 3 tons, with some specimens potentially reaching 6 meters in length. It had a broad, low-slung body supported by short, strong legs, and was protected by osteoderms, with a likely bony tail club used for defense. Tarchia was differentiated from Cicania by its larger basicranium, unfused paraccipital process quadrate contact, and wider premaxillary rostrum relative to the tooth rows in the maxillaries. In 2014, it was noted for its distinctive deep groove around the squamosal horn and an accessory osteoderm, and in 2016, it was recognized for differences in the skull's occiput and the presence of a postorbital fossa. It also lacked postocular caputegulae and had a proportionally high occiput in caudal view. Tarchia's fossils, once misattributed to Cicania, were found in Aeolian dunes and interdune environments. It was herbivorous, likely relying on hindgut fermentation for digestion, and may have shifted from bulk feeding to more selective feeding during the late Cretaceous due to environmental changes or competition.